New reports that President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, tried to set up back-channel communications with Russia to avoid U.S. monitoring. The reaction? Former Deputy CIA Chief John McLaughlin.
If an American intelligence officer had done anything like this, we'd consider it espionage.
The Trump administration responds, but not in front of cameras.
We're not going to comment on Jared. We're just not going to comment.
This after former CIA Chief John Brennan testifies that Russia can lure people unwittingly into treason.
Frequently, individuals who go along that treasonous path do not even realize they're along that path until it gets to be a bit too late.
My guest this morning, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker, former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, and Homeland Security Chief, John Kelly. And that congressional race in Montana. The Republican won, the Democrat closed the gap. Which party has reason to celebrate? Joining me for insight and analysis are MSNBC's Joy Reid, Kimberly Strassel, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, MSNBC political analyst Charlie Sykes, and Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, celebrating its 70th year. This is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning on this Memorial Day weekend. The president came home late last night from his first overseas trip in office, and when he did, the Russia investigation got much closer to home as well. So much closer, in fact, that it now involves the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. President Trump faces a growing scandal that threatens to overshadow his agenda and perhaps his entire presidency. Just consider what has happened in just the last week. Monday, Washington Post reports that Mr. Trump had asked his intel chiefs in March to push back specifically on then FBI Director James Comey's comments on the Russia investigation. Tuesday, former CIA Director John Brennan testifies that he saw intelligence revealing contacts between Russian officials and Trump campaign members that he thought deserved investigation. Thursday, NBC News reports that Jared Kushner is now under FBI scrutiny in the Russia investigation, though he is not a target. And then late Friday night, the Washington Post bombshell that Kushner and Russia's ambassador to the United States discussed setting up a secret backdoor channel using Russian communication facilities so that their pre-inauguration discussions would not be picked up by U.S. monitoring. That last item was so explosive that the Trump administration went out of its way yesterday to field reporters' questions off camera, even if they didn't actually answer them.
We're not going to comment on Jared. We're just not going to comment.
National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster did try to defend Kushner without saying his name.
Generally speaking, about back-channel communications, what that allows you to do is to communicate in a discreet manner.
It's very concerning that they wanted to have these communications at Russian diplomatic facilities using Russian phone lines. That shows that they were really trying to conceal this from the Obama administration and from U.S. intelligence.
The reactions to the Kushner story include just simple shock from the intelligence community.
I can't keep out of my mind the thought that if an American intelligence officer had done anything like this, we'd consider it espionage.
Reuters is also reporting that Kushner had at least 3 previously undisclosed contacts with the Russian ambassador, including 2 phone calls before the election, sometime between April and November. Kushner's attorney did not deny the story, but responded this way. Mr. Kushner participated in thousands of calls in this time period. He has no recollection of the calls as described. On Thursday, NBC News reported that Kushner is under FBI scrutiny, though not a subject of the investigation like former Trump aides Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn. Also this week, former CIA Director John Brennan publicly acknowledged for the first time his concern that Trump campaign associates, wittingly or unwittingly, may have been cooperating with Russian operatives, though he says he saw no proof of collusion.
I saw information and intelligence that was worthy of investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not such cooperation or conclusion was taking place.
Now the Senate Intelligence Committee has asked President Trump's political organization to gather and produce all documents, emails, and phone records going back to his campaign's launch in June 2015. Mr. Kushner was also in charge of the campaign's data operation.
I think we knew exactly where our 14 million voters were that we needed in those key swing states. I mean, Jared was an incredible leader to help make this all happen, you know?
At home, the president will not be able to avoid questions as he did overseas, beginning with his own party in Congress. many of whom were already losing confidence in his ability to lead.
I think we have a situation on our hands where every few days there's a new revelation.
The idea that Congress continues to do nothing about Russia interference in our election is completely unacceptable to me. In the next work period, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that we sanction Russia for interfering in our election.
Former House Speaker John Boehner told an energy conference Wednesday that foreign policy aside, everything else he's done has been a complete disaster. Joining me now is Republican Senator and the Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker of Tennessee. Senator, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Chuck, good to be with you.
Let me start with the allegations involving Jared Kushner and these meetings that he had where either he suggested or somebody suggested that a back channel be put together in some form, possibly using Russian facilities. Can you think of any good reason to do something like that in a transition period between one presidency over another?
Look, I think Jared has said that he's more than willing to answer any and all questions. They reached out to us yesterday to make sure that we knew that was the case, and I'm sure he's willing to do so. I look at what the reports have said about asking questions of him. It seems to me that he's, based on just the reporting that you and others are making, he's not a target, and so I think I would just wait. It sounds like he's more than glad to talk about all of these things, and instead of getting wrapped up into a lot of hyperbole, as these things can sometimes do, I think talking with him directly and getting him to answer any and all questions, as he said he would do, would probably be the prudent course of action.
I understand that, but can you think of any good reason? Let's take, as you know, you had the Washington Post bombshell, and then clearly, while the White House hasn't said much publicly, they seem to be talking anonymously to the New York Times, and they implied that, well, the meeting, it wasn't clear who suggested a back channel and that it was going to involve Mike Flynn and Syria. Here's what I don't understand. Why would anybody want to set up something like that if it was about Syria and not let the Pentagon know about it?
Yeah, I have no idea. Again, I think it's best to talk directly with these people. I know that from a military standpoint, obviously, we have ways of deconflicting with Russia on things relative to Syria. Again, Chuck, because I just don't know. I mean, these sources are not people who are willing to give their names. It's just hard to respond to things like this that, again, you know, no names attached, no dates attached. Look, let's let this unfold. And as I've spent a lot of time with Jared, he was over just recently in a bipartisan way briefing us on the upcoming trip. They achieved all of their goals. He seems to me to be a very open person, and again, I'd let him speak for himself when the time is right on all these issues, and at that time we can actually render judgment on the reality of what did or didn't take place.
The time is right. I guess I'm a little concerned. Do you not have a sense of urgency about this? This is, let's think about the time period here. You just had 17 intelligence agencies report that Russia interfered in this election. These interactions in the month of December, Senator Corker, you would think would trouble many people if they thought that, geez, there's been accusations that maybe they were the Russians were trying to assist one campaign or the other, and then to have these meetings and then to have them talk about the idea of avoiding American eavesdropping, I guess, if you want to call it that. None of this troubles you? I mean, you want to wait till it unfolds?
No, Chuck.
Okay.
These recent reports is what I'm talking about. I mean, again, as I understand it, Jared Kushner's more than glad to talk about all of these things. As it relates to the interference in the election, no question. And as you know, we've been allowing for a short period of time for Secretary of State Tillerson to see if he can change the trajectory in Syria. But this next work period, we very much, unless there's some major change in Russia's actions in Syria, plan to double down on sanctions with Russia. No, so absolutely not. Couldn't agree more with that. So I'm not disagreeing that they interfered with our elections, and we need to do something about that. So if you're trying to tie me into that,
I'm not trying to tie
I agree 100%.
I'm not trying to tie into knots, but you just, you just connected potential sanctions on Russian election to the behavior in Syria. Should that be connected, or should Russia be punished for election interference, period?
They should, and sometimes, Chuck, what we want to do is make sure that we're having a good outcome for our nation, and so we can act with passion over an issue. On the other hand, if we know that there are some negotiations taking place when our relationship with Russia is at the lowest point ever since 1991 for good reason, if there are some negotiations taking place relative to that, does it make some sense to give the Secretary of State some time to see where that goes? There are going to be sanctions against Russia, or at least a codifying of existing sanctions on Ukraine and Crimea. That is going to happen, but I think my job, and many people in the foreign relations community in general, is to make sure we have good outcomes. So, look, Russia is going to be punished for what it did in interfering in our elections. There's an investigation that's underway. I talk each week multiple times with Senator Burr and Senator Warner as to how that is unfolding. But again, to give a diplomat, I mean, everybody's going nuts over the 1% issue that we spend on diplomacy and aid. We care about diplomacy in our country. We want to make sure that it works. We want to give it every opportunity, and to wait a few weeks at the request of the Secretary of State to see if he can change things in Syria seems to me to be an appropriate thing to do. That's what we've done, but next work period we plan to take it up.
I was just going to say, you said a few weeks. It's been 4 months since they've taken office. So in your opinion, is it now time to decide the Russians aren't going to change their behavior in Syria?
Well, we'll see. I mean, unless there's something demonstrable that occurs. I read the intelligence on Wednesday morning down in the SCIF. It doesn't seem to me that they've changed their behavior in any way. So I think we're going to be moving on with this. I know the Banking Committee plans to do the same, but again, Chuck, I don't know what you're getting at here. You know, obviously, yes, it has been 6 months. So does waiting 2 or 3 weeks for the Secretary of State to see if he can negotiate a change, does that affect our ability to focus on what they did on the elections? I don't think so. And by the way, we're not going to wait for the Senate investigation, but there is an investigation underway in the intel community. Typically, you wait until those things are complete before you take action. In this case, we're probably going to go ahead just because of the clamoring for this to occur, rightly so. We're going to take up sanctions this next work period.
Let me ask you a question about the event. Speaking of your next work period, John McCain made this interesting analysis of all the things you guys got to get done in the Senate before Labor Day. Here's the reality. We've got 11 weeks between now and the end of September. We've got a repeal of Obamacare. We're talking about tax reform. We're talking about a defense bill. We're talking about, there's about 3 other things, a looming debt limit. How do you pack all that in? And so far, I've seen no strategy for doing so. I'm seeing no plan for doing so. There seems to be, he's not alone, but he's on the record. There seems to be a lot of concern among your colleagues that you have no idea how many of these things are going to get done in the next 3 months.
Well, it's obvious that not all of those things are going to get done in the next 3 months. There is a lot to do, and you know, we're right now meeting on health care. The meetings have been, I will say, very substantive. I would have liked for them to be more in the public, so you're bringing the public along. There seems to be some consolidation beginning to take place on tax reform. I had a great discussion this week with Fred Smith at FedEx, who's, I know, working with many business associates. There seems to be something gelling there. But no, we've got a lot to do. There's no question, and we're going to do the best that we can. But you know, we have a full 2-year congressional cycle here to get many of those things done. And again, I think we're moving along a thoughtful way with way too much work. You're right, to get done. A lot of people to get confirmed nomination-wise, spending issues, a lot to get done. It's a privilege to serve in the Senate to try to accomplish those things, and we'll move along as quickly as we can.
All right, Senator, I'm going to leave it there. Got a busy show this morning. Senator Bob Corker, Republican from Tennessee, thanks for coming on, sharing your views, sir.
Thank you.
You got it. Earlier this morning, I spoke with Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, and I began by asking him about the Jared Kushner news.
I know Jared. He's a great guy, decent guy. his number one interest really is the nation. So you know, there's a lot of different ways to communicate back channel, you know, publicly with other countries. I don't see any big issue here relative to Jared.
Even with an adversary, somebody that was at the time, our own intelligence community had collectively said this was a country that had infiltrated our election. Did this show good judgment?
Well, you know, it's before the government was in place during the transition period, I think, from what I understand, and I think any time you can open lines of communication with anyone, whether they're good friends or not so good friends, is a smart thing to do.
Had you ever, in your lifetime of government service, both in the military and outside of it, had you ever used another government's communications facility, though? The idea of sort of going around American communications? Well,
no, but I didn't have to. I mean, in my previous life, we wouldn't do that kind of thing. But you know, politics being what they are, a better way to put it, not politics, but the kind of interaction here in Washington, there's a lot of ways to communicate with people.
Intelligence sharing is something that's extraordinarily important to your job. If you get to the point where you now have our own intelligence community not very comfortable with how this administration is dealing with intelligence, how problematic is that for you?
For me, and again, I don't necessarily accept this, you know, the issue of the issues related to intelligence being a problem right now. But for me, I mean, I interact with my counterparts overseas all the time. I rely on all of the intelligence community to make decisions that I make. It's not an issue for me, for sure.
Did you, I want to just one more time going back to the Russia thing, is this any way, are you concerned that if there is a back channel over here that it is going to actually disrupt our ability to know what the Russians are up to?
Well, just because you have a back channel, if indeed that's what Jared was after, doesn't mean that he then keeps everything secret. I mean, he shares that. But the back channels, as I understand it, and of course every administration has had it all the way, you know, forever. Back channel communications with people are ways to communicate with people, again, not in front of the, you know, press as an example, but that information is, you know, not necessarily kept secret from the rest of the government.
Does Jared Kushner have the same level of security clearance that you do?
I don't know.
On intelligence front? Is that something you should know?
Not necessarily. I mean, everything we do in the security world, classification world, of course, before I would start talking to anyone, I would make sure that they had the, you know, the requisite security clearances. I mean, I'm cleared for, you know, top secret, compartmented SCI, that kind of thing.
So your understanding of Jared, is Jared the same way?
I don't know, but if I ever had to talk to him or anyone else about intelligence at the level at which I'm briefed in, I would make sure that they had that clearance before I talked to them.
I got to ask you about a comment you made on Friday. Here it is. Let me get you to explain.
I was telling Steve on the way in here, if he knew what I know about terrorism, he'd never leave the house in the morning.
I have to admit, it was a little jarring. I don't know if you meant it tongue-in-cheek or not. What do you mean by that?
There are incredible plots against the United States, terrorism plots against the United States. The really, really good news is that we have incredible men and women that are protecting us every day. You know, the away game, overseas, Department of Defense, CIA, NSA, the home game, fought by DHS, local law enforcement, FBI. Every single day there are people plotting to try to hurt us from a terrorism point of view, and every single day we beat them, the men and women of law enforcement. Again, I say DHS, FBI, DOD, we beat them every day, but we have to be perfect. They just have to be lucky ones.
It was interesting to me that you seemed to say that you wouldn't sleep at night. I mean, how serious, if we had a threat level the way the UK has it, would we be at the highest level?
Well, I mean, we have no specific threats right now. Otherwise, we'd be at a higher level.
Okay.
But there's always a threat. And we just are vigilant every day. And again, the 99.9% of Americans can sleep safe in their homes at night. Their children are protected. They are protected. But it is a relentless mission of our law enforcement, intelligence, military people to protect America.
Did British Prime Minister Theresa May have a point when she complained to the United States about leaks?
She did.
She did? It did come from our side?
I don't know where the leak came from, but I will tell you this, as I always do in cases like this. I immediately called my counterpart in UK, and after offering my condolences about the attack, and unbelievably the third time in 120 days I've done that, I've called the minister and offered my condolences. She immediately brought this topic up, and if it came from the United States, it's totally unacceptable. And I don't know why people do these kind of things, but it's borderline, if not over the line of treason.
You believe it's treason to leak some of this stuff? You believe that's treason?
I do believe it is. I believe when you leak the kind of information that seems to be routinely leaked, the high level of classification, you are telling the...
And what was leaked on this Manchester bombing, you believe, maybe even meets say, treason?
I think it's darn close to treason.
Mr. Secretary, I'm running out of time, and I have to leave it there. Coming up, how unusual is it for an incoming White House to attempt to arrange a back channel with a foreign government to elude U.S. monitoring? I'll ask my next guest, former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. But first, throughout the show, as we go to break on this Memorial Day weekend, we pause to honor our fallen men and women in uniform. Welcome back. As questions continue to swirl about the Trump transition team's communications with the Russians, I want to walk through the timeline of when specifically all of these events took place, because we have learned more through at least out the month of December of 2016. It was on the 1st or the 2nd that we now know Jared Kushner and Mike Flynn met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak to reportedly discuss setting up a system of back-channel communications between the Trump transition and the Kremlin. For what reason? That's in dispute. Later in December, Kushner meets with Sergei Gorkov, the head of a sanctioned Russian state-owned bank. The bank was sanctioned, not the individual. On December 29th, calls take place between Flynn and Kislyak, allegedly to discuss the new sanctions that the Obama administration had issued against Russia that day. Those sanctions were in response to Russian interference in the election. Well, joining me now is the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Mr. Clapper, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chuck.
Before I get into the Russia story, you just heard Secretary Kelly talk about the leaks that took place. We know the UK complained about the Manchester bombing, and he referred to some of these leaks that they sort of walk up to the line of treason. Some might say, hey, they're just leaking out something that they think the public should know. Where do you draw that line?
Well, I think, first of all, I have to say that leaks are damaging, they're corrosive, they risk compromising sources, methods, and tradecraft. As we've seen recently, they damage relationships with crucial partners. You know, UK and Israel come to mind. And this is particularly serious now because, in my experience, 50-plus years in intelligence, I don't know of a time when we depended more on friends and allies for sharing information and intelligence, particularly with respect to terrorism. So I know Secretary Kelly takes this quite seriously, and he should. You know, legal definition of what's treason, I'll leave that to the lawyers. But just from a practitioner standpoint in the intelligence business, leaks are bad.
All right, let me go through the issue that has been the bombshell this weekend, this issue that Jared Kushner, at the time private citizen, yes, a private advisor at the time to the president-elect, was having these meetings with the ambassador to Russia, Sergei Kislyak, and they hid these meetings from public eye. We also learned that he met with the head of a sanctioned Russian bank. You were still the Director of National Intelligence in December. Are these things that you would have known?
Well, yes, they would have. And just to reinforce John Brennan's former Director of Central Intelligence Agency, his comments before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And I have to say that without specifically affirming or confirming these conversations, since even though they're in the public realm, they're still classified. But just from a theoretical standpoint, I will tell you that my dashboard warning light was clearly on, and I think that was the case with all of us in the intelligence community, very concerned about the nature of these approaches to the Russians. If you put that in context with everything else we knew the Russians were doing to interfere with the election, and just the historical practices of the Russians, who typically almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever, which is a typical Russian technique. So we were concerned.
And this is what's likely triggered the FBI's now extra attention to Jared Kushner that we've been reporting, that they believe he has more information. They're saying he's not a target. It would have been intelligence like this that would have triggered it?
Well, I think so, and I think John alluded to his concerns that he expressed to the FBI, which is the proper channel. I have to say, you know, at the time I left, I did not see any smoking gun certitude evidence of collusion, but it certainly was appropriate for, given all the signs, certainly appropriate for the FBI to. And necessary for the FBI to investigate.
Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States, there's been different ways people have described him. Does the intelligence community believe he basically is an agent of the KGB? Or the FSB, well, the old KGB?
Given the fact that he oversees a very aggressive intelligence operation in this country, the Russians have more intelligence operatives than any other nation is represented in this country, still, even after we got rid of 35 of them. Mm-hmm. And so to suggest that he is somehow separate or oblivious to that is a bit much.
Why didn't we kick him out? Why didn't he specifically get sanctioned? If he basically is viewed not as the ambassador to a country, not as a diplomat, but as basically the American head of an intelligence agency, that's sort of what you just described.
I'm reflecting an intelligence perspective. You know, we're paid, intelligence people are paid to be suspicious, and of course that whether to expel people or declare them PNG is, at least in the last administration, was an interagency determination. And so what we did do is get at 35 of the more notorious intelligence operatives and ask them to leave quickly.
One of the caveats in the Washington Post bombshell story was that the Russians frequently will do misinformation, even in intel channels. How often does that happen? How likely is it in this case?
Well, it happens a lot. It happens overtly and covertly, and certainly that was one of the tools that the Russians used in the run-up to our election, was fake news, misinformation, paying trolls to insert phony information in social media. So this is a standard practice of the Russians and the Soviets before them.
If Jared Kushner's meeting with somebody that you referred to as sort of oversees a large intelligence operation, and while you said you didn't see any smoking gun on collusion, how close to the line is that in your mind?
Well, it certainly arouses your concern about what's going on. Given, you know, Russia, at least for my money, is our primary adversary. They are not our friends. They are in to do us in. And I have to say as well, Chuck, you know, we have a kind of a time-honored custom in this country that we have one president and one administration at a time. And oncoming administrations don't get a head start before the end of the current president's incumbency.
What would you like to see? What's the appropriate action now that you would like to see take place against Russia? Is sanctions enough at this point?
Well, I think really not for me to say what happens now. I think certainly The sanctions are a compelling, powerful weapon. The Russians don't like them. And I think what the actions the last administration took, the sanctions and other actions on the 29th of December, I always thought of as a first step. And I haven't seen any change in Russian behavior anywhere that would merit a relaxation, and if anything, an increase in those sanctions, as we've learned more about, more has become public about what they're going to do. And as I said at the Senator Graham's subcommittee hearing on the 8th of May, they are only emboldened. They're going to continue to interfere in our political process, and to me, that's the big story here, and what American people should be concerned about.
James Clapper, I have to leave it there. The former director of national intelligence, somebody I think people are getting used to. You're almost going to be referred to as a member of Congress. We see you up there.
Oh, I hope not.
Yes. Anyway, Mr. Clapper, thanks for coming on and sharing your views. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chuck.
When we come back, much more on the Russia investigation. Plus, Republican Greg Gianforte, who infamously body slammed a reporter, won that congressional race in Montana. But the Democrats closed the gap. So which party has more reason to smile this weekend? But first, as I told you before the last break, we continue to honor those who have fought. Welcome back. Panel is here. Charlie Sykes, of course, longtime Wisconsin conservative radio guy and an MSNBC political analyst. Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Joy Reid, host of AM Joy on MSNBC. And Kimberly Strassel, columnist for the Wall Street Journal. The president is tweeting this morning. Let's get people up to speed on this. Not specific of what he's referring to, but I think you'll get an idea. It starts with, "It is my opinion that many of the leaks coming out of the White House are fabricated lies made up by the fake news media." Then he says, "Whenever you see the words sources say in the fake news media and they don't mention names, it is very possible that those sources don't exist but are made up by fake news writers. Fake news is the enemy." Okay, Amy Walter. It is now, there's not a specific, we don't want to assume that he's referring to a specific story. Likely it's to what is going on with his son-in-law.
There's no doubt. Look, I think what we're learning is we don't know that there's a fire, but there is a whole lot of smoke, and that cloud is blocking everything. And I think if you're the president right now trying to get back on course, you thought that going overseas, having a foreign trip, 9 days, this was going to reset. We're going to be talking about that trip today. We're not talking at all about the 9 days that he spent overseas. We're talking about what's been happening here. We're going to continue to talk about it. And I think the most important thing, one of the most important things you talked about with Senator Corker was the fact that this black cloud is also blocking out what he needs to reset. What Republicans need to reset is actually getting points on the board with something happened legislatively. They have a Republican House and Senate and White House, and nothing is moving. The one thing that has passed, the House health care bill, not particularly popular. It's stuck in legislative purgatory right now in the Senate. And all those other things, tax reform, the budget, they're not going anywhere either. If you're a member thinking about running for re-election in 2018, you're not just worried about the Russia piece, but what are you going to talk about when you go home over the next recess about what you've actually been able to accomplish?
By the way, Charlie Sykes, we've been hearing all weekend long, we get our weekly, hey, there's going to be a staff shakeup story. And I feel like it is a weekly and it doesn't happen. But there have been all sorts of chatter, oh, the president's going to have somebody vetting his tweets. Well, I think they've gotten to him in this case. Yep. He used the phrase, "it is my opinion," before putting all of that out about fabricated lies. He has we did a cursory search. He's never used that phrase or "I think" in his tweets before, since so far going back as president.
You might almost think that these were kind of low energy tweets from the president, but it does look like, you know, we know the president has lawyered up. Are the lawyers now going to be looking at his tweets? Look, you know, the nightmare here for the White House is this is not an alignment of the planets, it's a collision of the planets. You now have, you know, the Russia investigation, you have the family, you have the finances. We're not talking about drip, drip, drip anymore. It's a torrent. And I think that the difficulty of this White House dealing with this is going to be exponentially raised by the fact that now it is Jared Kushner. And, listening to, the folks you had on earlier, the reluctance of Republicans or members of the administration to criticize Jared Kushner because this is family. This is one of the reasons why you avoid nepotism generally in business and in politics, because he's the one guy you cannot fire. He's so close to the president. This raises the threat level exponentially.
Kim?
I think we are having a discussion that is absolutely divorced from reality this week. It is astonishing to me. Let me set the scene for you. It's 2008. We were having an election, and candidate Obama, he's not even president-elect, sends William Miller over to Iran to establish a back channel and let the Iranians know that should he win the election, they will have friendlier terms. Okay, so this is a private citizen going to foreign soil, obviously in order to evade U.S. intelligence monitoring and establishing a back channel with a sworn enemy of the United States who was actively disrupting our efforts from the military in the Middle East. So is that bad judgment? Is that a bad thing that happened? Back channels are completely normal. They happen all the time. Reagan did them. Obama did them. Everyone did. So I'm not quite sure why supposedly having, at least the president's now elected, setting up a back channel with the Russians is somehow out of bounds.
Well, here's one key difference. In October, months before this latest meeting, and it was one of 18 separate contacts that we now know of between the Trump campaign and Russia, our primary adversary in the world.
And a major superpower.
In October, the collective judgment of the 17 intelligence agencies had been that Russia had been taking active measures to interfere in our elections. Quite a difference. We don't think that Iran was doing that. And Russia, so we know that that was happening in October. So in December, the now president-elect decides that he's going to name Jim Mattis to be his Secretary of Defense. But he doesn't open a back channel. He sends his real estate developer son-in-law, supposedly, or the real estate developer son-in-law decides to open this back channel, not just, and it isn't a back channel, by the way, because this isn't how it works. You don't go to the adversary country and say, let's set something up inside of your secure facility, in your embassy, so that we evade our intelligence services, we set it up inside of your secure facility, which even takes them aback, because that's bizarre, the idea that we're going to do this on your facility. And you send him to do that without Jim Mattis, the real estate developer who has no foreign policy experience whatsoever. And then if it's a channel about opening up negotiations in terms of something realistic, in terms of something about foreign policy, why are they also back channeling with a bank, a Kremlin-connected Russian bank? And why is the Reuters report saying that part of the discussion was the possibility of opening up opportunities for financing for Trump-related
Well, we don't know the answers to any of those questions, because what we're getting here are
that is not a back channel. By definition, what I just described is not a back channel.
You have to follow the money, you have to follow the meetings, the lies, the attempts to
we don't have any of that information.
To derail this investigation. And the reality here is that Jared Kushner and the Trump administration apparently trusted the Russians more than the intelligence community. Look, how can this not be suspicious?
Why would you trust? I'm sorry, by the way, we can't forget that the intelligence services and also the Defense Department were being run by the Obama administration. They had plenty of reason not to necessarily want the Obama administration to know what they were doing.
What did they want to hide? This is suspicious
because
at minimum. It is suspicious. What did they want to talk about? Why would you use Russian?
And why would you not maybe want to have all of these people in these departments with this information, which they would go on to leak on a daily basis in the coming months to try to derail your presidency?
In December, the election was over. In this country, we have a continuity of government. We hand over peacefully power from one party to another all the time. I've done so for more than 240 years. Are you telling me that the now elected Trump administration didn't trust John Brennan, that somehow these straight arrow guys in our intelligence services were going to now work to actively undermine? Are they now seeing them as some sort of dissident that we're going to undermine? That has never happened in the history of the United States.
One of the most interesting pieces of news that actually came out this week was the FISA court revelation that they said that the Obama administration had been actively engaged in abusing Fourth Amendment protections by unmasking people's identities on a routine basis, which they did not acknowledge to the court. in which they said brought up major concerns. So maybe you wouldn't trust that team, in fact.
Who said that? Where does it source
The
that
FISA
information?
court.
Do you know how difficult it is to get a FISA warrant against an American person?
Yeah, but
do you
you're
know
not talking about what I just mentioned.
All right, I'm going to pause this conversation because I do have to go to break because I do have to pay for bills on this. So let me do that. We are a for-profit enterprise. Coming up, Hillary Clinton's first full-throated criticism of President Trump.
Or even denying things we see with our own eyes, like the size of crowds.
But as we go to break, we continue to honor our fallen men and women in uniform. Welcome back, Data Download Time. Is Donald Trump remaking the Republican Party, or was the party already remaking itself in a way that allowed Donald Trump to walk in? Well, there's evidence that GOP was becoming Trumpian before Trump even got there. Our data guru, Dante Cini, analyzed NBC News Wall Street Journal polling going back to 2010 to help us understand this trend. Education is a key measure. In 2010, 41% of college graduates called themselves Republican, while 39% said they were Democrat. In 2016, that number was 39% for the Republicans, a 2-point drop, and 45% for the Democrats, a 6-point jump. It's actually a big swing overall when you look at it. Democrats now have the edge with college-educated voters. The reverse, of course, is true with those with a high school degree or less. Republicans have seen a 5-point jump with that group, while Democrats have seen a 5-point drop. Also, a pretty significant swing. This education gap follows some geographic trends that we've been following. It helps explain, for instance, why some of the most vulnerable Republican districts have the highest education rates, like the special election we're watching in the 6th district of Georgia, outside of Atlanta. Now, some other areas where Republicans have seen the most growth: men over the age of 50, up 5 points. Rural voters, also up 5 points. And those between the ages of 50 and 64 are now 4 points more Republican than 7 years ago. Now, for the Democrats, there's been a 7-point jump in those making $30,000 to $50,000 per year, sort of smack dab in the middle class there. 18 to 34-year-olds, not just millennials, but Gen Z, up 6 points. And those with postgraduate degrees also up 6 points. Bottom line, we're in a political realignment. We're in the middle of it. That's why it's not clean, and it's going to take more than one election to figure this out. These trends do help explain why Barack Obama won 2 terms and, frankly, why Donald Trump won in November. This process is still fluid, and it's making our elections a bit more unpredictable than we have become used to. Before we go to break, we want to note the passing of former Senator and Hall of Fame pitcher Jim Bunning, who died yesterday at the age of 85. Bunning was a congressman, a 2-term senator from Kentucky, and the only member of Congress to throw a perfect game in the major leagues. And we lost a member of our extended NBC family. Former National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, died on Friday. He, of course, is also the father of our own Mika Brzezinski. Brzezinski emigrated from Poland, was a scholar, and ultimately moved to the White House. He maintained an enduring suspicion of the Soviet Union and worked tirelessly to limit Soviet expansionism in the late 1970s. Our thoughts, of course, go out to our colleague Mika and her entire family, who tweeted Friday night, "Chief at the helm, we love you, Dad, and will always be grateful for the love and devotion you showed us all."
Coming up, meet the press endgame and postgame. Brought to you by Boeing. Always working to build something. Endgame is brought to you by Boeing. Always working to build something better.
Back now with Endgame, I feel like we're going to do a political speed round here. We got to try to get all of this stuff in. Montana, Amy Walter, you do this for a living. You're the handicapper here on House races. Republicans win by 6 points in a state that has a Democratic senator, but looks demographically more like a Trump state. Who should feel good right now? You know, it's like Pee Wee soccer. Everybody gets a trophy. Yeah. Right? So on the Republican side, they got to win. They win, period. And this is not just good because they have a person in that seat who's a Republican, but it's good for recruiting and it's good for retaining, right? This is the time of the year where people are trying to get candidates to run, getting donors to support candidates, and getting members who are incumbents to run for re-election. Right. So a toxic environment, bad for those things. Winning, good, helps on the Republican side. The bad side, if you're Democrats, what you're looking forward to is the margin in a lot of these special elections. A lot narrower, a lot closer. Democrats overperforming where a traditional Democrat could be. 5 points here in Montana, 12 points in Kansas.
if Democrats are going to take control of the House, they got to overperform nationally, somewhere between 5 and 8 points. So it's not going to help in a really deep red state like Montana to overperform by 5. It will help in the lighter shade of red.
But Charlie, it does seem as if, boy, Georgia's now a must-win for the Democrats, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. You know, in terms of setting that narrative. But I will say that the real significance of what happened in Montana was, once again, we've moved the line. We've moved the line in terms of acceptable behavior. You know,
you're referring to the body slamming of the reporter,
and the body slamming itself, I think, was not as significant as the reaction to the body slamming. The way in which so many conservatives, so many Republicans felt that tribal loyalty demanded that they rationalize this, and what's been happening is this, you know, whether you want to call Donald Trump the role model in chief, the fact is you have so many now Republicans and conservatives, and I am one of them, you know, who now model their behavior after this. This thin-skinned, nastiness that mimics confidence.
Let me throw in, you know, Mark Sanford put a voice to this, Republican from South Carolina. Respectfully, I'd submit that the president has unearthed some demons. I've talked to a number of people about it back home. They say, well, look, if the president can say whatever, why can't I say whatever? He's given them license. Do you buy this, Kim?
Well, I don't think that you can blame the body slamming of a reporter by an individual on President Trump, but it is true. We look to a president to sort of set tones and standards, and I think all of us would be happier if President Trump was, in general, exuding a little bit more of a respectful tone to everybody. Look, people like that he's blunt-spoken, and that's fine, but there's a difference between being blunt-spoken and being crude or and discourteous in politics.
Words have consequences. Words have meaning. Ideas have consequences. And it's one thing to, I think, be upset with the bias of the news media, but again, we've moved the line now to just pure, raw loathing, and he has stoked those fires.
Last word.
Well, you had Donald Trump this morning tweet that journalists, presumably he means the journalists at the Washington Post and the New York Times, literally make up and invent sources. During the campaign, one of the most chilling images that stuck with me from it was a gentleman at a Trump rally who had a T-shirt on that said "Rope Tree Journalist." Donald Trump whipped people up to attack the media. Our own Katie Tur experienced it. Anyone who was at a Trump rally experienced it. He is the head of that party. He sets the tone.
Guys, that's all I have for today. Pretty jammed week. Have a happy and safe Memorial Day weekend. We're back next week, because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the